Hey there, it's Katie Jarvis with Managing the Mess. If we haven't met before, I'm a K-6 elementary art teacher, and I teach in a Title I school just outside of Washington, D.C. In this video, we're going to be talking about talking. Now, don't get me wrong, talking can be a really positive thing in the art room. You can be collaborating, you can be sharing, you can be connecting with your students, and that has its place. In this video, we're going to talk about talking from the negative side, when students are shouting out during your lesson or talking while you're talking. I'm going to share some proactive tips that will hopefully help you and you can use in your classroom tomorrow. As teachers, we can relate to this by thinking about what it's been like when we've been in a staff meeting or professional development. Sometimes you just get a sense that it's okay that you can sort of whisper to your friend that the person speaking is sort of allowing that and setting the tone that that's okay. Other times, the person that's speaking might ask you in a meeting to close all laptops and put away distractions and call people out that are not focused. They may move around the room. Just like that's happening to us adults, where we sort of get the sense of whether something's kind of okay, we can get away with it or not, your students are as well. So despite what you're teaching them at the beginning of the year, if you're not following through on that, and if you're not saying what you mean, your students are very quickly going to pick up on that and definitely take advantage with their talking. Let's first talk about what you can do to be proactive about talking in your classroom. The first thing you need to do is make a plan. What is it you're going to do when students interrupt your lesson? So if they are talking and shouting out during your lesson, how are you going to react? You may want to have a couple different ways that you would react. If a student is having a little side conversation with another student, how do you want to react to that? And what you decide to do, you want to be consistent with. Especially in the beginning of the year, you want to go over and over and over those things when you're noticing something that is less than ideal behavior. If you are finding this video in the middle of the year, let's say, and you have allowed students to kind of shout out through the year, it's going to be harder to fix this. If from the very beginning, you are very, very focused on this and very consistent with this, it's going to pay off that it's much easier to teach throughout the school year. So it's definitely worth your time to go really slow and make sure that every time that someone is talking while you are talking, you stop and address that. You want to be protecting learning. That is your job as the teacher, to protect the learning in your classroom. One way that I do this is that I have a red zone and a yellow zone. So this indicates to students whether they need to stop talking and raise their hand. That would be my red zone. Or in my yellow zone, it means that they need to work quietly. In addition to this, I have a noise sensor. So I have one of those electronic doorbells, and it will go off if my students are talking too loudly. I'll just hear this sound and say, oh my goodness, we set off the noise sensor. And we'll have discussion about bringing the noise level down. I also tie it in with my point system in my classroom, so we would get one of the negative points if the noise sensor does go off. I use the Mona Lisa as a symbol for the students of what good listening looks like. So that's something you want to teach. I revisit this each and every class at the beginning, that I say Mona, they say Lisa, Mona, Lisa, Mona, Lisa. I show them the painting. We check that hands are still, eyes are forward, lips are zipped. I'm saying that every single time. I'm setting those high expectations that's my definition of good listening. When my students are working at their seats, one thing that I like to do that I just discovered really works pretty well in my classroom is last year we started listening to podcasts. Now I'm going to give some information about those podcasts that we've really enjoyed at the end of this video, so make sure that you keep listening. At the beginning of my classes, I also always review my classroom rules. And one of my rules is raise your hand. So I'm giving that reminder and we're reciting those rules before anyone has had a chance to shout out in my lesson. I'm setting that expectation so students know what is going to upset me if it's not followed. You really do need to teach listening. You need to teach students how they should be seated, whether they're in the stools or chairs. How does that look? What do you allow? Can they lean back? Can they not lean back? Can they lean forward on their table? Can they have their hoods up? I would address all of that very clearly at the beginning of the year. If they're on the carpet, how is it that you want them to sit? What do you want students to do with their hands when they're listening? What do you want them to do with their eyes? Is it okay for them to shout out comments and have a conversation with you? Or do you prefer that they raise your hand? Set those things up from the beginning of the year and it will really pay off. There are some proactive things that you can do before your students shout out. First, of course, is teaching your students to raise your hand. If you have younger students, kindergarten and first grade, maybe even second grade, that are really having trouble with blurting out, you can teach them put their hand over their mouth so that they don't, hey, I am raising my hand, but I'm shouting out the answer. They're not doing that, okay? So you kind of teach this so that they're remembering to keep that answer inside. Another thing you can do is praise students when they are raising their hand. Before you even really call on them, say, thank you for raising your hand, and then allow them to speak. When you're asking questions, make sure that you are saying, raise your hand if, and then asking the question. So you're already putting in that positive reminder so you're not having to backtrack and say, no, raise your hand. If someone is just shouting things out at you, you can try to ignore them. So you simply just pretend as though you didn't hear their answer and see if they catch on. You can say something like, oh, I can't hear you if you're not raising your hand. And that will kind of get them to figure it out. It helps too if you say that when you're just sort of looking around, so you're not really like focused in and picking on that one student. You can also stop if you even just have one or two kids that are doing this and reteach this to the entire group instead of calling out just those one or two students. You can ask a student to move to a different location if they are really struggling with this. Sometimes if you're on the carpet and they move back to their seat, they remember why they are there. Often with shouting out, especially when I get into the year, I will use my 1, 2, 3 magic behavior management system that I will give them one free warning. On that second warning, I am recording that this happened in my notes, and I'm letting the classroom teacher know that this is something that we're working on. When I get to the third reminder about shouting out, that's when they have to take a break. So they might just move away from the group. They might move to my take a break spot in my room. But when that happens, I do let their family know that that is something that we are working on. So what do you do if students are talking during your lesson? Well, there's some proactive things that you can do before this ever happens. One thing is that you can teach your students, this is my turn to talk and this is your turn to talk, and point out those different times in the class. So when you start your lesson, you can remind the students they need to show their Mona Lisa listening and that this is your turn to talk, that they won't be talking to a friend at this time. When you're teaching, move around the room. Just having that proximity can make students feel like, oh, they're not so comfortable. They're not going to start a conversation whispering in the back of the room. Often when you're interrupted, you can just pause and look, and students will stop talking. Another thing you can do is say, we're waiting on 2 people. I'm ready to start talking about painting, but we're just still waiting on 2. And then pause. And for those 2 people, they will catch on. You get a little bit more buy-in when you're not calling them out and singling them out by name. Often, if you do this in the upper grade levels, you'll have kids say, well, I wasn't talking, even though they clearly were talking. It just goes a little smoother when you say you're waiting on 2 people, but you don't mention any names. Another thing that I found that works is I will just I won't even be talking about anything with the lesson. I'll just start talking quieter and explain that we're waiting on like 2 people that are talking when I'm talking. And as soon as they start listening, and I just keep whispering this, so that the other kids that are paying attention stay still engaged, but the kids that are talking kind of catch on that like something is different, what am I missing? And they become refocused. Make sure that you don't just call out your students and correct them. Ask some questions. Sometimes you need to ask things like, what is distracting you? Sometimes you'll find out, somebody has a knot in their shoe. And the other person said, I'm really good at untying knots. Can I please help you? Okay. If that's going on, that's positive talk. It's just not the time for that. So you can help the students to know, hey, when we go back to their seats, to work on our project, that's the time. Why don't you two friends stay on the carpet? You can help each other with that shoe issue. You can also ask, hey, it seems like you're a little bit distracted. How can I help you focus? Sometimes when two kids are talking, they're not having a good conversation with each other. One person might be bothering the other person. That one person might be wanting to listen. The other person wants to talk about what happened in the soccer game at recess. So ask those questions. Do you go through, your consequences if this happens to a student repeatedly, or if you see a pattern of this happening week after week? Loop the classroom teacher in that it's something that you're working on, and also have conversations with parents so they know what is happening in the classroom and they can also encourage their students at home. If you're interested in learning more ways to encourage your students to behave positively, and if you're interested in the podcast that I use in my classroom, you're going to want to check out this video next.